Honestly, Emma, sometimes I think our lives would have been so much easier if you were never born. My mother's words hung in the air above the white tablecloth at Gibson's Steakhouse, suspended between the flickering candlelight and the soft murmur of other diners celebrating their own milestones, and I felt something inside me crack in a way that I knew, even in that moment, would never fully heal. It was June 10th, 2019, and I had just graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in computer science. Had just spent 4 years working myself to exhaustion to earn not just my degree, but a 3.97 GPA, and recognition from the dean, and a job offer from Google that I hadn't even mentioned yet because I was waiting for the right moment, waiting for some small opening where my mother might actually want to hear about my life, my accomplishments, the future I had built for myself through countless sleepless nights and sacrifice. But there would be no right moment. I understood that now, as I watched her take a sip of her wine, her face showing not a trace of awareness that she had just said something devastating, something that a mother should never say to her child under any circumstances, let alone at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. My father sat beside her, cutting his steak with careful precision, his eyes fixed on his plate as they always were when my mother said something cruel, his silence a form of agreement that hurt almost as much as her words. Across the table, my younger brother Tyler smirked into his vodka cranberry, 19 years old and already working on his second drink, fresh off his first year at University of Illinois, where he had failed 2 classes and barely passed the others. Though my parents had never once expressed disappointment about his performance, the way they had scrutinized every A- I brought home throughout my childhood. The restaurant continued its expensive hum around us, other families laughing and toasting. And I sat there in the black dress I had bought specifically for this dinner, the gold summa cum laude cord from the graduation ceremony still in my purse, because I had been foolish enough to bring it, thinking maybe, just maybe, they would want to see it, want to take a picture, want to acknowledge in some small way that their daughter had accomplished something remarkable. I had been foolish about many things where my family was concerned, I realized. Foolish for 22 years, and as I looked at my mother's face, at my father's averted eyes, at Tyler's barely concealed contempt, I felt something shift inside me that I didn't yet have words for, something that felt like the beginning of the end of trying to earn love from people who had apparently decided long ago that I wasn't worth giving it to. The pattern had been there my entire life, though I hadn't understood it fully until I was old enough to step back and see it clearly, to recognize that what I had experienced wasn't normal family dynamics, but something more deliberate, more cruel. I was 7 years old when I won first place in the regional science fair, had spent weeks building a model of the solar system that actually rotated, and my parents missed the award ceremony because Tyler had a soccer game that same afternoon, a regular season game where his team lost 4-1, and he spent most of the time on the bench. I remember standing on that stage at Hawthorne Elementary School, holding my blue ribbon, scanning the audience of proud parents with their cameras, and finding the space where mine should have been empty. And my teacher, Mrs. Chen, had taken a photo of me with her own camera, had printed it out and given it to me the next day because she felt sorry for me, though I didn't recognize the pity in her eyes at the time. When I was in 5th grade, I was selected for the gifted program, scoring in the 99th percentile on the standardized tests. And my mother's response was to remind me that I needed to help more around the house because I was the older child and Tyler needed her attention for his activities. Tyler played soccer and basketball and tried baseball for one season, and my parents attended every single game, bought him whatever equipment he needed, paid for private coaching that cost $200 per session, while I taught myself piano from YouTube videos because lessons were too expensive right now. In 8th grade, I was valedictorian of my junior high graduation, and my parents came to the ceremony but left immediately afterward without taking any photos because Tyler had a basketball tournament that evening. And I spent what should have been a celebration dinner, sitting in a gym, watching 13-year-old boys miss layups while my parents cheered from the stands. High school was 4 years of the same pattern. each instance building on the last, until the weight of being invisible became something I just learned to carry. I made the National Honor Society, the math team, the debate team, earned a perfect score on the SAT math section, and each achievement was met with a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation shifted back to Tyler, to his social life, his average grades that were good enough, his need for a car when he turned 16. They bought him a used Honda Civic, $7,000 that I knew they didn't really have, while I was told that if I wanted a car, I could save up from my part-time job at the library where I shelved books for $9 an hour. I was 17 years old, working 15 hours a week on top of my advanced placement classes, saving every dollar for college, because I understood by then that whatever I achieved in life, I would achieve alone, without their support or encouragement, and that understanding should have freed me. But instead, it just made me try harder, made me think that if I could just be exceptional enough, accomplished enough, perfect enough, they would finally see me the way they saw Tyler, would finally look at me with pride instead of vague disappointment that I existed at all. College was supposed to be my escape, my chance to build a life where achievement mattered and hard work was recognized. But the pattern followed me even to Evanston, even to Northwestern's beautiful campus on the shore of Lake Michigan, where I had earned a full academic scholarship that covered tuition and most expenses. My parents never mentioned the scholarship as an achievement, only as lucky timing and one less thing to worry about. And I understood that they meant one less thing standing between them and their ability to pour everything into Tyler, who started at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, 2 years after I began at Northwestern with full parental financial support, despite having barely graduated high school with a 2.8 GPA. I worked 3 part-time jobs during my college years, tutoring computer science students at $40 an hour, working the front desk at the campus library for $12 an hour, and doing freelance web design for local businesses whenever I could find clients. Because my scholarship didn't cover housing or food or books or any of the thousand small expenses that accumulate when you're trying to survive in one of the most expensive college towns in the country. Tyler worked 0 jobs, lived in university housing that my parents paid for, had a meal plan and spending money, and came home every other weekend with laundry and an empty stomach that my mother filled while asking him nothing about his classes, his grades, his future, just letting him exist in their house like a beloved pet that required care but no expectations. I called home once a week that first year, then once every 2 weeks, then once a month as I realized that every conversation lasted less than 10 minutes before my mother would say, "That's great, honey, but I need to go. Tyler needs help with something." And my father would barely speak except to ask if I needed anything. And when I said no, because I had learned not to ask them for anything, he seemed relieved to end the conversation. I came home for Thanksgiving my sophomore year and spent the entire weekend hearing about Tyler's fraternity, his social life, his potential, while I sat at the kitchen table working on a major programming project that was due the Monday after break. And when I explained that I couldn't go to some family gathering because I had work to do, my mother sighed and said I was always so serious, always studying. You need to learn to have fun like your brother. I stopped coming home except for Christmas after that, made excuses about internships and summer classes, and the truth was that I had a summer internship at Microsoft in Seattle after my junior year that paid $8,000 for 10 weeks and gave me experience that would change my career trajectory. But when I told my parents about it, my mother said, "That's nice," and immediately started talking about how Tyler was thinking about changing his major for the 3rd time and wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life, as if his uncertainty deserved more attention than my concrete achievement. My roommate Sophia, who became my best friend during those 4 years, watched this dynamic play out over and over, heard the phone calls that left me quiet and hurt, saw me work myself to exhaustion while Tyler coasted on my parents' money and support, and she was the first person who ever said out loud what I had been afraid to acknowledge. "Emma, they treat you like you don't matter, and you deserve so much better than that." I didn't believe her then, Not fully, because I had spent 22 years learning that my worth was conditional and Tyler's was inherent. But her words planted something in me that would eventually grow into the strength I needed to walk away. The graduation dinner was at Gibson's Steakhouse in downtown Chicago, the kind of restaurant with white tablecloths and prices that made my stomach clench when I saw the menu. And I knew my parents had chosen it because they wanted to appear generous, wanted to be seen celebrating their daughter's achievement, though the performance was for their own satisfaction rather than mine. I had graduated summa cum laude 3 days earlier, walked across that stage in my cap and gown, with honors cords in purple and gold, and my mother had spent the entire ceremony on her phone texting Tyler about some crisis in his life that couldn't wait 2 hours, while my father had fallen asleep during the keynote speech. But here we were at this expensive restaurant on a Saturday night, and I had made the mistake of being excited, of letting myself believe that maybe this time would be different, that my graduation from one of the top computer science programs in the country with a 3.97 GPA might finally be enough to earn their genuine pride. I told them about the job offer over appetizers, couldn't keep the smile off my face as I explained that Google had offered me a position as a software engineer in their Mountain View office with a starting salary of $120,000 plus benefits and stock options, and I watched my father's eyebrows raise slightly in what might have been surprise while my mother set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Tyler, who had driven up from Urbana for the dinner though he'd skipped my actual graduation ceremony, was scrolling through his phone and barely looked up when I spoke. My mother was quiet for a long moment, and I felt that familiar, desperate hope rising in my chest, that maybe she was just processing it, maybe she was about to say she was proud of me. But then she cleared her throat and said, "Well, that's a decent salary, I suppose. Though Tyler could make much more than that once he figures out what he wants to do. He has so much potential, he just needs to find the right path." The words hit me like cold water, like every other dismissal in my entire life. But somehow worse because I had actually believed this achievement might be different, might be big enough to matter. I looked at my father, waiting for him to say something, to contradict her or acknowledge what I had accomplished. But he just reached for his wineglass and took a long drink, his silence as damaging as her words. Tyler smirked without looking up from his phone, that knowing expression that said he understood exactly how this family worked and where he stood in it and where I didn't. Something crystallized in that moment, something that had been building for 22 years, suddenly snapping into sharp focus. I set down my own fork carefully, feeling my hands shake slightly as the hurt transformed into something else, something clearer and stronger. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, their attention, their basic recognition of my worth, and I was done. I was finished begging for scraps of validation from people who had decided long ago that I didn't matter. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor, and my mother looked startled, asked where I was going, and I said I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave, which was true in a way, because I felt sick with the weight of finally understanding that nothing I ever did would be enough for them. I walked out of Gibson's Steakhouse at 8:30 on that May evening, the first time in my life I had ever walked away from them, and I knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to change. I took an Uber back to my apartment in Evanston, the driver mercifully silent as I stared out the window at the Chicago streets blurring past, and by the time I walked through my door at 9:15 that night, I was shaking with something that felt like rage and grief, and relief all tangled together in my chest. Sophia was there, sitting on our worn couch, studying for her law school entrance exam, and she took one look at my face and closed her book, asked what happened, and I told her everything, the words spilling out in a rush that left me breathless and crying. And she listened without interrupting until I finally ran out of things to say. She hugged me for a long time, then made tea neither of us drank, and said the words I needed to hear. "You don't owe them anything, Emma. You never did." I sat at our small kitchen table until past midnight, just thinking, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name, but recognized as important, necessary, long overdue. My phone buzzed twice with texts from my mother asking where I had gone and saying I had embarrassed them by leaving, and I turned it off without responding, the first time I had ever ignored her messages. I pulled out the offer letter from Google, the one I had printed and kept in my desk drawer, and I read it again slowly, letting myself actually see the words. This time, starting salary of $120,000, signing bonus of $25,000, comprehensive benefits, stock options, relocation assistance to San Francisco. I had earned this, every single piece of it, through 4 years of relentless work and sacrifice and determination, and it was mine regardless of whether my parents acknowledged it or celebrated it or even understood what it meant. I made my decision that night sitting at that table with Sophia asleep in her room and the city quiet outside my window. I would take the job, would move to San Francisco in 6 weeks when my start date arrived, and I would stop trying to win my parents' approval or recognition or love. I would build a life where my achievements mattered, where I was surrounded by people who saw my worth, where I didn't have to beg for basic respect. The decision felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying for 22 years, and even though I knew there would be pain ahead, confrontations and difficult conversations, and the grief of accepting that my parents might never be who I needed them to be, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. I went to bed at 2 in the morning with the offer letter on my nightstand, and for the first time since I could remember, I fell asleep not thinking about what I had done wrong, or how I could be better, or what I needed to change to make them love me, but instead imagining a future where none of that mattered anymore, where I was free to simply be myself and let that be enough. 3 months later, I was sitting in a conference room on the third floor of Google's Building 43 in Mountain View, California, looking out at palm trees and feeling like I was living someone else's life, someone who got to be happy and valued and seen for who they actually were. The move to San Francisco had happened quickly, a blur of packing and goodbyes and one final tense phone call with my mother, where she had alternated between guilt-tripping me about abandoning the family and making passive-aggressive comments about how California would be too expensive and I would probably fail and have to come crawling back. And I had listened with a detachment that felt new and powerful, letting her words wash over me without penetrating, without finding those old wounds to reopen. I had said goodbye to Sophia with promises to visit and daily video calls, and she had driven me to O'Hare Airport on a humid August morning and told me she was proud of me, and I had cried in the terminal, but they were different tears than I was used to crying, tears of fear and hope rather than pain and rejection. Work at Google had been challenging and consuming in the best possible way. My days filled with code reviews and team meetings and complex problems that required every bit of my training and intelligence, and my manager Chen had noticed immediately that I was good at what I did, had complimented my work in our first one-on-one meeting, and assigned me to increasingly important projects. I had made friends with my teammates, young engineers from around the world who invited me to lunch and happy hours and weekend hikes in the mountains. And slowly I was building something that felt like a real life, one where I mattered and contributed and belonged. I had started therapy in September, finding a practice in the Mission District, and Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that what I had experienced wasn't normal family dynamics, but actual emotional neglect and favoritism, had given me language for the pain I had carried and tools for building healthier patterns. My contact with my parents had dwindled to brief text exchanges every week or two, surface-level updates that revealed nothing real, and I had noticed with a mixture of relief and sadness that they barely seemed to register my absence, their conversations still consumed with Tyler, who had apparently dropped out of University of Illinois after failing most of his classes and moved back home. My mother's texts about Tyler painted him as lost and searching and needing support to find himself, while any questions about my life were cursory and followed by immediate pivots back to their concerns. I was learning slowly that my worth existed independent of their recognition, that I could be successful and valuable and enough without their validation. Though some mornings, I still woke up with that old familiar ache of wanting them to see me, really see me, and be proud. Chen had pulled me aside 2 weeks earlier in November and told me that the project I had led, a infrastructure optimization that had reduced server costs by 18%, had gotten attention from senior leadership, and there was talk of a promotion opportunity coming up in the new year, and I had felt pride bloom in my chest, pure and uncomplicated by anyone's dismissal or diminishment. I was thriving in ways I had never imagined possible when I was sitting in that Evanston apartment making the decision to leave, and some part of me was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this new life to reveal itself as temporary or conditional, but it kept not happening, kept being real, and mine and stable in ways my family had never been. The promotion came through in January, 6 months and 2 weeks after my start date, and Chen called me into his office on a Tuesday morning to tell me I was being moved to senior engineer with a salary increase to $185,000 plus an expanded stock option package. And I had sat in that chair feeling something close to disbelief that this was my actual life, that I had earned this through my own work and talent, and no one could diminish it or take it away. My project, the infrastructure optimization that had started as a routine assignment, had ended up solving a cascading problem across 3 different systems and saved the company an estimated $4 million annually, and suddenly people I had never met were stopping me in hallways to congratulate me or asking me to consult on their projects. I called Sophia that night, and she screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and we celebrated over video chat with wine on both coasts. And I realized this was what it felt like to share good news with someone who was genuinely happy for you, without qualification or comparison or diminishment. I didn't call my parents, didn't even text them, and I waited to see how long it would take them to check in, to ask how I was doing, to show any interest in my life beyond the bare minimum. 3 weeks passed with no contact, and then on a Thursday evening in late January, my phone rang with my mother's number, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, maybe curiosity, or maybe some old instinct I hadn't fully killed. She didn't ask how I was, didn't make small talk, just launched immediately into the purpose of her call. Tyler was having a hard time, had dropped out of school officially, and was living at home trying to figure out his path, and they were supporting him financially while he looked for work. But it was becoming a strain, and she wondered if I could help out, maybe send some money to help with his expenses since I had that good job and probably didn't need all that money anyway living alone. I sat on my couch in my apartment in the Richmond district looking out at the fog rolling in and felt something crystallize inside me, hard and clear and unmistakable. I said no, just that one word, and the silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then my mother's voice came back, shocked and hurt, asking how I could be so selfish, reminding me that family helps family, that Tyler was struggling, and I had always had everything so easy with my scholarships and my lucky job offers, and I interrupted her, my voice steady in a way it had never been before, and told her that I had earned everything I had, that Tyler's choices were not my responsibility, and that I would not be sending money. My father got on the line then, his voice carrying that edge of disappointment I knew so well, telling me I was being ungrateful and cruel, reminding me of everything they had done for me, and I pointed out quietly that they had paid for Tyler's car and his apartment and his tuition while I had worked 3 jobs to cover my expenses, and the silence that followed told me they had never actually thought about it that way, had never counted the cost of their favoritism in concrete terms. The call ended badly, my mother's voice rising in anger before she hung up on me, and I sat holding my phone, feeling shaky, but also something else, something that felt like freedom, like I had finally drawn a line they couldn't cross, and for the first time in my life, I had protected myself instead of trying to earn their love by sacrificing everything I was. The calls and texts started escalating after that, my mother reaching out every few days with messages that alternated between guilt tripping about family obligations and passive aggressive comments about my selfishness. And my father sent awkward emails reminding me that parents make sacrifices for their children and expect the same in return, as if the years of working 3 jobs while they paid for Tyler's everything had never happened. I ignored most of it, responding occasionally with brief neutral messages that gave them nothing to work with, and I thought maybe this was the new normal, this cold distance punctuated by their attempts to extract something from me. Then, in early March, my mother called with a different tone, almost cheerful, to tell me that my cousin Maria was getting married in late April in Chicago. A big family wedding with everyone coming in from around the country, and of course they expected me to be there because family shows up for family, and I had been so distant lately, and people were asking about me. I felt my stomach tighten because I knew exactly what this was. Another opportunity for them to present their perfect family narrative to the extended relatives, with Tyler positioned as the golden child despite his obvious failures, and me in my usual role of the afterthought daughter who existed to make everyone else look good by comparison. I told my mother I would think about it, that work was busy, and I wasn't sure I could get away, and she made a sound of exasperation and said that this was exactly what she was talking about. How I thought I was too important now with my job to care about family, and I needed to remember where I came from and stop being so selfish. I hung up feeling that old familiar guilt trying to sink its hooks into me, the voice in my head that sounded like my mother telling me I was ungrateful and wrong for wanting to protect myself. I called Sophia that evening and told her about the wedding and my mother's pressure, and I expected her to tell me not to go, to maintain my boundaries and stay away from people who hurt me, but instead she was quiet for a moment, and then said something I hadn't expected. Maybe I should go, but on my own terms, from this new place of strength and distance I had built. She pointed out that I wasn't the same person who had left Chicago 9 months ago, that I had a promotion and success and a life they couldn't touch, and maybe it was time to face them from that position of power instead of avoiding them, to let the extended family see who I actually was, instead of the narrative my parents had constructed. I sat with that for several days, the idea both terrifying and compelling, and I thought about whether I was ready to walk back into that den of dismissal and favoritism, whether I could maintain my boundaries and self-worth in the face of my mother's inevitable comments and Tyler's smirking presence. Finally, in mid-March, I texted my mother that I would come to the wedding, and I booked my own hotel room at the Hilton downtown instead of staying with them, and I scheduled my flight so I would arrive Friday afternoon and leave Sunday morning, giving myself the minimum exposure time necessary. I told Chen I needed that Friday off for a family event, and he approved it immediately, and I started preparing myself mentally for what felt less like a family reunion and more like walking onto a battlefield. Except this time, I had armor they had never seen before, and I was going to show up as exactly who I had become despite their every attempt to diminish me. I landed at O'Hare on Friday afternoon in late April and took a car to the Hilton, checking into my room on the 14th floor with its generic corporate view of downtown Chicago, and I stood at the window for a long moment, feeling the strangeness of being back in the city where I had grown up, but approaching it now as a visitor, someone passing through, rather than someone who belonged here. The rehearsal dinner was at 6 at Shaw's Crab House in River North, the private room my aunt had reserved for 40 people, and I dressed carefully in a navy silk blouse and tailored pants that had cost more than I would have spent on an entire outfit a year ago. And I looked at myself in the hotel mirror and saw someone who looked professional and confident and completely unlike the uncertain girl who had sat at that graduation dinner 10 months earlier. I arrived exactly on time and walked into the private dining room where extended family I hadn't seen in 2 years were already gathering around tables with drinks and appetizers, and the moment I entered, I felt the familiar dynamic settle over me like a weight, the feeling of being observed and judged, and found somehow lacking even before anyone spoke. My cousin Maria saw me first and rushed over with genuine warmth, hugging me and exclaiming how good I looked and asking about San Francisco. And for a few minutes, I felt the possibility that this weekend might be manageable, that maybe I had worried for nothing. Then my mother appeared from across the room and approached with my father and Tyler trailing behind her, and her smile was tight and performative as she embraced me briefly and said loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear that she was so glad I had finally made time for family, that they had worried I had forgotten about them entirely out there in California. Tyler looked worse than I had imagined, his face slightly bloated and his eyes carrying the dull expression of someone who spent most of his time on screens. And he gave me a smirking nod, but didn't speak. And my father offered an awkward side hug and asked about my flight in the tone of someone fulfilling an obligation. I moved through the room greeting aunts and uncles and cousins, some of whom I had been close to as a child, and others who had always been peripheral to my life. And I noticed how they responded to me in different ways. My cousin Jennifer, who had graduated from nursing school 3 years ago, asked detailed questions about my work and seemed genuinely impressed when I described my projects, while my Aunt Patricia made vague comments about how nice it must be to live somewhere with good weather, and then immediately pivoted to talking about Tyler's potential and how he was just finding his way, and sometimes young people needed time to discover their path. I watched my mother work the room, touching shoulders and laughing at appropriate moments, and steering conversations back to Tyler whenever anyone asked about me. And I saw the pattern I had lived my entire life playing out in real time. My accomplishments acknowledged only briefly before being redirected to Tyler's possibilities. His failures reframed as temporary setbacks, while my successes were treated as fortunate accidents rather than earned achievements. During dinner, I sat between Jennifer and my cousin Marcus, who worked in finance in New York. And Marcus asked about Google's stock performance, and when I mentioned my promotion and stock options package, his eyebrows rose with genuine interest, and we had a real conversation about tech industry compensation and career trajectory, and I felt myself relaxing slightly into the pleasure of being taken seriously by someone who understood professional achievement. Across the table, I caught Tyler watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between resentment and disinterest. And my mother was speaking in an animated voice to my aunt about Tyler's plan to maybe take some online courses or look into trade schools, presenting his complete lack of direction as thoughtful career exploration rather than what it obviously was. Saturday afternoon, I stood in my hotel room, preparing for the wedding with a care and attention I had never given to a family event before, choosing a dress I had bought specifically for this occasion at a Nordstrom in San Francisco, a fitted emerald green cocktail dress that had cost $400 and made me look like someone who belonged in boardrooms and upscale restaurants. And I styled my hair in loose waves and applied makeup with the kind of precision I had learned from YouTube tutorials watched late at night in my apartment. And when I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, I saw someone I almost didn't recognize, someone who looked polished and successful and completely in control. The ceremony was at 3 at Holy Name Cathedral, beautiful and traditional, with Maria in an elaborate white gown and her fiancé, David, looking appropriately nervous. And I sat in a pew near the back, watching my extended family fill the ornate space. And I felt strangely detached from it all, as if I were observing from behind glass, rather than participating in something that was supposed to bind us together. The reception was at the Four Seasons with lake views and a live band and round tables dressed in ivory linens, and I found my assigned seat at a table with various cousins, including Jennifer and Marcus from the night before, and I was grateful not to be seated with my immediate family, who were at a table near the front with other aunts and uncles. The cocktail hour flowed into dinner service and then dancing and speeches, and I moved through it all with a strange sense of anticipation, as if I were waiting for something to happen without knowing exactly what it would be. People approached me throughout the evening asking about San Francisco and my job at Google, and their responses varied in ways that reflected their own relationship to success and achievement. Some, like Jennifer, seemed genuinely excited and asked detailed questions about what I actually did and whether I liked the Bay Area, while others, like my Aunt Patricia, offered vague congratulations before changing the subject or making comments about how tech companies exploit young workers with long hours. I was standing near the bar ordering a glass of wine when my Uncle Roberto approached me, and I recognized him immediately even though I hadn't seen him in at least 3 years. My father's older brother, who had built a successful commercial real estate business in Atlanta, and who my parents always spoke about with a mixture of respect and envy. He greeted me warmly and said he had been hoping to run into me this weekend, that he had heard through the family grapevine about my position at Google and wanted to hear more about it directly from me, and we moved to a quieter corner of the reception space where we could actually hear each other speak. Roberto asked intelligent questions about my work and my career trajectory, and when I described my recent promotion and the machine learning project I was leading, his eyes lit up with genuine interest, and he told me about his own company's attempts to integrate technology into property management systems and asked if I had any insights. We talked for nearly 20 minutes about artificial intelligence applications and career development and the tech industry's trajectory, and it was the first conversation I had had with a family member in years where I felt truly seen and valued for what I had actually accomplished, rather than what I represented in someone else's narrative. I noticed my parents watching from their table across the room, my mother's face tight with something that looked like irritation, and I realized with a jolt of satisfaction that this bothered her. This visible evidence that someone in the family respected me and sought out my expertise, and I felt a shift inside myself, a readiness for whatever was going to come next. Roberto and I finished our conversation, and he excused himself to greet some other guests, and I watched him walk away feeling strangely fortified by the interaction, as if his recognition had given me permission to claim my own accomplishments in a way I had never allowed myself to do before. I returned to my assigned table where Jennifer and Marcus were talking about the bride and groom's honeymoon plans to Italy, and I had just sat down when I heard my mother's voice carry across the space between tables, that particular pitch she used when she wanted to be overheard by people beyond her immediate conversation. "Well, I'm just so glad Emma finally decided to show up for family," she was saying to my Aunt Patricia, her tone light but edged with something sharp. "We were starting to think she was too good for us now, off in California with her fancy job." I felt the words land like they were meant to, felt the eyes of relatives at nearby tables flicker toward me and then away, and something inside me went very still and very calm. Jennifer reached over and touched my hand briefly under the table, a gesture of solidarity, and I gave her a small smile to show I was okay, but I could feel my heart beginning to pound with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. My mother continued as if she hadn't noticed any reaction, though I knew she had gauged it precisely. "It's hard when children forget where they came from, forget the sacrifices their parents made for them," she said, and my Aunt Patricia made some non-committal sound that might have been agreement, or might have been discomfort. Tyler, sitting next to my mother with a drink in his hand that was probably his fourth or fifth of the evening, laughed and said loud enough for me to hear, "Emma's always been like that, thinks she's smarter than everyone else." My father sat in his usual position of silent complicity, looking down at his plate, and I realized with absolute clarity that this was the moment, that I had come back to Chicago for exactly this confrontation, even if I hadn't fully admitted it to myself until now. I stood up from my table and the movement drew attention, several conversations pausing as people registered that something was happening, and I walked the few steps to my parents' table with my head up and my hands steady at my sides. "Actually, I'd like to address that," I said, my voice carrying in the sudden quiet that had fallen over our section of the reception hall. My mother looked up at me with surprise that shifted quickly to irritation, and Tyler's smirk faltered slightly, and my father finally raised his eyes to meet mine with an expression I couldn't read. "Since we're talking about showing up for family and being too good for people, I think there are some things that need to be said out loud here, in front of everyone who's been hearing your version of our family story for years. My mother's mouth opened to speak, but I continued before she could interrupt, my voice steady and clear in a way I had practiced without knowing I was practicing it for 22 years. Let me start with my college graduation dinner 3 months ago, I said, looking directly at her. I had just graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in computer science, and I was trying to tell you about my job offer from Google, $120,000 starting salary, and do you remember what you said to me? She shifted in her seat and said, Emma, this isn't the time or place. But I shook my head and repeated her exact words. You said, we wish you were never born, then we wouldn't have to pretend to be proud of someone so ordinary. And when I looked shocked, you laughed and said I was too sensitive, that it was just a joke. I heard several gasps from nearby tables and saw Jennifer stand up from our table, moving closer as if to offer support. And my uncle Roberto had also risen from where he had been standing near the dance floor, his face serious and focused entirely on me. My mother said, That's not what I meant, you're twisting my words. But her voice had lost some of its certainty, and I could see relatives exchanging glances that suggested they were reassessing everything they thought they knew about our family dynamics. I'm not twisting anything, I said, my voice still calm, still factual. I'm just finally saying out loud what has been true my entire life, which is that nothing I have ever done has been good enough for you, while Tyler has been celebrated for doing the absolute minimum. I turned slightly to include Tyler in my gaze and saw him shrink back in his chair, his earlier bravado evaporating. When I was in 8th grade, I won the Illinois State Science Fair and qualified for nationals, and you didn't come to the award ceremony because Tyler had a soccer game that day where he sat on the bench for 90 minutes, I continued, and I saw my cousin Marcus nodding. I saw recognition on several faces around me. When I got accepted to Northwestern with a full academic scholarship, you spent dinner talking about how Tyler would probably go pro in soccer if he focused, even though he was third string on a mediocre high school team. My father finally spoke, his voice quiet but strained. Emma, please, not here. And I looked at him with something that might have been pity. You have been silent my entire life when it mattered, I said. You sat there at every dinner, every holiday, every moment when she diminished me, and when Tyler mocked me, and you said nothing, which is the same as agreeing with them. I watched him look away and felt the truth of that statement settle over the gathered family like a weight. I worked 3 jobs during college while you paid for everything for Tyler at state, tuition, and rent, and spending money. And when he failed out after 2 years, you increased his allowance, I said, my voice rising slightly with the accumulated pain of years. I graduated with honors, and you couldn't be bothered to stay for the full ceremony, but you wanted me to be grateful that you showed up at all. Uncle Roberto spoke then, his voice carrying authority. Is this true, Michael? He asked my father, and my father's continued silence was answer enough. My mother stood abruptly from her chair, the legs scraping against the floor, and said, I don't have to listen to this. I won't be attacked at a family wedding. But I took a step forward and said clearly, Please sit down and hear what I have to say, because you've never actually listened to me in 22 years and you're going to listen now. Something in my voice must have carried more authority than she expected, because she hesitated, half standing, and Uncle Roberto said firmly, Sit down, Carmen, let her finish. And my mother sat back down with her face flushed and angry. I pulled my phone from my small clutch purse and opened my email app, scrolling to the message I had received just 2 weeks ago from Google's compensation team, and I turned the screen toward the table so my parents and several nearby relatives could see it. 3 months ago, when you dismissed my job offer as ordinary, I was making $120,000, I said, my voice steady and factual. Last month, I was promoted to senior software engineer, and my current salary is $185,000 a year, and 2 weeks ago, I was granted stock options that vested immediately due to the success of my project, options currently worth $300,000. I watched my mother's face go pale, and my father leaned forward to look at the phone screen, as if he didn't believe what he was hearing. And Tyler's expression shifted from defensive to something like shock. Uncle Roberto moved closer, and I handed him my phone, and he read the email carefully before saying to the assembled relatives, "This is legitimate. This is a significant achievement in her field." And I saw Jennifer and Marcus exchange glances that looked like vindication. "So when you say I'm too good for this family now, what you mean is that I've succeeded beyond what you ever imagined I could, and it makes you uncomfortable because it reveals how wrong you've been about me," I continued, and I could feel my hands trembling slightly, but my voice remained clear. "Meanwhile, you've spent the last 6 years pouring money into Tyler, paying for a college education he failed out of after 2 years, supporting him while he lives in your house unemployed, giving him an allowance at 19 years old that's more than I had to live on while working 3 jobs." Tyler started to protest, and I turned to look at him directly. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Tyler. I'm stating facts. And the fact is that our parents' favoritism hasn't helped you any more than their dismissal helped me. It's just damaged us in different ways." I saw something shift in his expression, something that might have been recognition or shame, and my mother said, "We were just trying to help him find his way," her voice defensive but lacking its earlier conviction. "You've been draining your retirement accounts to support him," I said, looking at both my parents. "Aunt Patricia told me last night that you've asked her for a loan twice in the past year, that you're struggling financially, and yet when you called me 3 months ago, it wasn't to apologize or to have a real conversation. It was to ask me to send money for Tyler's expenses." My father's face confirmed this before he even spoke, and Uncle Roberto said quietly, "Is this true, Michael? You're in financial trouble?" And my father nodded, looking down at his hands. "I have $70,000 in savings right now, not counting the stock options," I said. And I saw several relatives react with surprise at the amount. "I could help you. I could write you a check today that would solve your immediate problems, but I won't, because money isn't what you need to give me, and it's not what I need from you." The reception hall had gone almost completely quiet around us, other guests at distant tables sensing drama, but not knowing the details, and the DJ had stopped the music as if recognizing that something significant was happening. What I needed was for you to see me, to recognize my worth, to celebrate my achievements the way you celebrated every minor thing Tyler did, and you couldn't give me that," I said. And I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "So I've built a life without your validation. I've learned my worth from people who actually see me, and I'm successful and happy in ways you'll never understand because you were too busy wishing I was never born." My mother's face crumpled, and she put her hands over her face and began to cry, her shoulders shaking in a way that looked performative even as I recognized that some part of her distress might be genuine. And Aunt Patricia immediately moved to her side and put an arm around her while my mother said through her tears, "I'm being attacked at a family wedding. My own daughter is humiliating me in front of everyone." I watched several relatives move toward her with expressions of concern, including my grandmother, who shot me a look that was pure disappointment, and I felt the familiar pull of guilt that had controlled me for so many years. The instinct to apologize and retreat and make myself smaller so that everyone else could be comfortable. But I didn't apologize. I stood there with my shoulders back and let the moment play out, and I saw Uncle Roberto shake his head and say firmly, "She's not attacking you, Carmen. She's telling the truth, and the fact that the truth is uncomfortable doesn't make it an attack." Jennifer appeared at my side and took my hand, squeezing it in support, and Marcus came up on my other side and said quietly, "I'm glad you said it. Someone needed to say it." Then my cousin Lucia, who was 25 and had always been kind to me in a distant way, approached and said with tears in her eyes, "I experienced the same thing with my parents and my brother Daniel. Everything I did was expected, and everything he did was celebrated, and I didn't realize other people saw it too." I looked at her with recognition and gratitude, and suddenly several other cousins were nodding and coming forward, and my cousin Andrea said, Our whole family has this pattern. The boys get celebrated for existing, and the girls get criticized for not being perfect. And I realized that my experience wasn't isolated, that it was part of a larger family dysfunction that had been quietly damaging multiple people for years. Tyler sat frozen in his chair, looking down at his plate, his face red with what I thought was shame or anger or some combination of both. And when I looked at him, I felt something unexpected, which was sympathy, because I meant what I had said about the favoritism damaging him too, about how being handed everything had left him without skills or resilience or any sense of his own capability. Uncle Roberto came over to me and said, "I want to offer you mentorship. I've been impressed with your career from what I've seen on LinkedIn, and I think you have extraordinary potential, and I regret that I didn't reach out sooner to tell you that." And his validation coming from someone I respected professionally meant more to me than I could articulate in that moment. My father finally stood up from the table and walked over to me with his hands hanging awkwardly at his sides, and he said, "Emma, I'm sorry. I should have said something. I should have stood up for you." And his apology sounded sincere, but also insufficient, because sorry didn't undo 22 years of silence and complicity. I looked at him and said, "I appreciate that, but what I need going forward is not just an apology. I need you to actually see me and treat me with respect. And until you can do that consistently, we're going to have very limited contact." And I watched him absorb this boundary with the expression that suggested he hadn't expected consequences. My mother had stopped crying and was now watching the cousins gather around me with an expression that looked like betrayal, as if my honesty had stolen something from her, and she said to Aunt Patricia loud enough for me to hear, "I always knew she was selfish. Everything has to be about her." And I felt the words hit me, but they didn't land the way they would have 6 months ago, because I had built enough self-worth that her assessment of my character no longer had the power to define me. I stayed at the reception for another 20 minutes, exchanging contact information with Jennifer and Marcus and Lucia, and several other cousins who wanted to stay connected, and Uncle Roberto gave me his personal cell phone number and said we would schedule a lunch meeting when I was next in Chicago, or if he came out to the Bay Area for business. I hugged the cousins who had supported me, and I nodded politely to the relatives who still seemed uncomfortable with what had happened, and then I collected my small clutch purse and walked out of the reception hall with my head high and my heart lighter than it had felt in years. The hotel where I was staying was only 3 blocks away, and I had already checked out that morning, my suitcase stored with the concierge, so I collected my bag and took an Uber directly to O'Hare Airport, and I sat in the terminal waiting for my flight back to San Francisco with a sense of peace that felt almost unfamiliar. I had told the truth. I had set boundaries. I had walked away from a situation that was never going to give me what I needed, and the freedom of that choice settled into my bones, like coming home to myself. The flight back was smooth, and I spent most of it looking out the window at the country passing below me, thinking about how far I had traveled, both literally and emotionally, in the past year since graduation. When I landed at SFO and took the BART back to my apartment in the Mission District, I felt like I was returning to my real life, the life I had built with intention and effort, and my small one-bedroom apartment felt more like home than my parents' house ever had. 3 weeks after the wedding, Uncle Roberto called me, and we had a 2-hour conversation about my career trajectory and his contacts in the tech industry. And he introduced me via email to 2 VP-level executives at other major companies who he thought I should know. Jennifer started a group chat with me and Lucia and Andrea and 3 other female cousins, and we talked almost daily about our experiences and supported each other in setting boundaries with our families. My parents sent me an email 10 days after the wedding, a carefully worded message that acknowledged I had been hurt but framed it as a misunderstanding rather than a pattern of deliberate dismissal, and they said they wanted to repair our relationship, but the tone suggested they expected me to do most of the work of repair. I waited 2 days before responding, and I wrote back that I was open to rebuilding our relationship, but only if they were willing to acknowledge specifically what they had done wrong, and demonstrate through consistent actions over time that they saw me as valuable and worthy of respect. I told them I would not be coming home for Thanksgiving or Christmas this year, that I needed more time and space, and that when we did see each other again, it would be in a neutral location where I felt safe. Their response was delayed by almost a week, and when it came, it was shorter and colder, suggesting that I was being unreasonable in punishing them, and I realized with clarity that they were not yet capable of the kind of honest reckoning that real reconciliation would require. I didn't respond to that second email, and I didn't feel guilty about my silence. 2 months after the wedding, I was sitting at a restaurant in Hayes Valley with Sophia and two friends from work, Maya and David, eating tapas and laughing about a ridiculous bug that had appeared in our code that afternoon, and I realized with sudden overwhelming gratitude that this was my chosen family. These people who saw me clearly and celebrated my successes and supported me through challenges. Sophia raised her wineglass and said, "To Emma, who is killing it at life." And Maya and David joined the toast, and I felt tears prick at my eyes, but they were good tears, tears of recognition and belonging. I thought about the girl I had been a year ago at that graduation dinner, still seeking approval from people who would never give it, still believing that if I just achieved enough or proved enough, I could make them see my worth. I understood now that my worth had never been the question. Their capacity to recognize it was the limitation. And I had wasted years trying to solve a problem that was never mine to solve. I had my career and my friends and my hard-won self-knowledge, and I had the peace that came from knowing I had told the truth even when it was difficult, and I had walked away from a dynamic that was slowly killing the best parts of me. The future stretched out ahead of me full of possibility, and I was no longer waiting for permission from anyone to claim it. I was enough. I had always been enough, and I was finally free to live like I believed it.